I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I am so excited for today's video. Today we are gonna dye some beautiful roving that is 85% Blue Face Leicester BFL, 15% Tussa Silk, and we are going to lightly apply this KoolAid in patches to create speckles and splotches that will leave some of this beautiful, natural, warm gray color behind. Before I explain more about the project, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner, Patty Dahl. Patty, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. BFL silk blends are some of my favorites to spin in the whole world. And while I haven't dyed this exact blend before, I have dyed merino silk blends, and I'm really excited. So again, Patty, I cannot wait to see how this turns out, and thank you for being my lab partner. I have been wanting to re-explore speckling roving for a while now. Instead of going for super fine speckles, going for larger splotches that will blend out beautifully once it's spun. And it's been on my list for a very long time to revisit, but then when the April 2021 Paradise Fibers Fiber of the Month Club box arrived with a speckled KoolAid project, how could I resist? As many of you know, I started my dyeing journey with KoolAid, and I cannot deny an awesome, fun KoolAid dyeing project. Now, this video is not sponsored by Paradise Fibers. I am an affiliate marketer with them. I love their Fiber of the Month Club box, which they send me for free every month. I have a whole playlist of their unboxings. I'll link to that below. But I, again, couldn't resist, and this fiber is so beautiful that I am really excited to play with it with this technique. Because as I mentioned, preserving some of this beautiful natural color is going to be awesome. Paradise Fibers included some really great instructions. I'm not going to be following these because I do have experience dyeing yarn and dyeing roving with KoolAid. But the one piece I think of advice I'm going to take from this is that they recommend adding vinegar to the Presoak, which is not something I always do with KoolAid. And that's because KoolAid packets already contain citric acid in addition to the artificial food coloring. And normally that amount of citric acid is totally sufficient for the food coloring to bind to your protein-based fiber like wool and silk and things like that. But in this particular case, I do know that silk does take longer, and silk blends, they need more acid for colors to bind. So it's not going to hurt anything to add vinegar to the Presoak, and if anything, it might help us get sort of that splotchy color that we are going for. I do have a very similar series of videos that is dealing with a different type of blend, just 100% wool, where I dyed the roving with Dry KoolAid powder, wanted to see how it sunk in, and then I actually spun it up 2 different ways in spinning vlogs. It has been way too long since I've done a spinning vlog, but I do have those videos on the channel. And then I even knit it into a hat that I called the Cloudy Rainbow Hat for a baby rider way back in the late summer of 2016. I will also include information about all of those videos down in the video description. The box did come with about 8 ounces of fiber, but today we are going to dye 105 grams with just these 2 packets of KoolAid. During the unboxing, I decided that I did want to braid this up before the project. I really enjoy using just a braid like this of roving for dyeing, but especially when I plan to leave some resist and leave some natural color. It is also just a way that makes me less nervous about felting because it is a little easier to keep it arranged and then rinse after the fact. This is not something that you have to do by any stretch. It's just a preference, or not even a preference, it's just something that I enjoy doing, and it'll make it easier to lay it out on the counter. Because each time I move the fiber around now, the total length is shorter, so it's easier to pick up and put down without adding additional stress onto it. But again, this is not something that is essential to the process, but it will make it easier for us to add dye to one side, and even when wet, to then flip it over and add some dye to the other while maintaining some of this beautiful natural color. I have this basin about half full of just plain room temperature tap water, and then I'm adding a 1/4 cup of white vinegar. And now we will just add our Roving to pre-soak for a little while. I'm probably gonna let it soak for a few hours so it's completely saturated, but when you aren't trying to get even color coverage, you do not need to pre-soak as long, because if you don't care if you have natural color left, then it doesn't matter if the water is all the way soaked. But in general, for silk, I do typically recommend pre-soaking longer than my standard 20 to 30 minutes. So we will do a couple of hours today, but if you wanted to over dye this a really saturated color, then I might even recommend doing an overnight soak, and I am gently pressing to remove those air bubbles. I want to quickly give a quick recap about what is required to dye yarn with food coloring. You need your artificial food coloring, which we have in our KoolAid packet. You need acid, which again we have in the KoolAid packet in citric acid, but we also just added vinegar to the pre-soak. You need a protein-based, an animal fiber. So wool, alpaca, silk. What we're using today is absolutely perfect with the BFL silk, but unfortunately you cannot dye cotton or synthetics like acrylic with food coloring. Finally, you need heat. And my two top contenders for today are either to steam set in the microwave or to steam on the stovetop. Now, when I'm dyeing yarn with food coloring, I am personally comfortable using standard pots, pans, things that I have at my disposal in my kitchen. However, today I am planning to use some of my dedicated dye equipment because I enjoy using that for dyeing yarn. So the one thing that I will say is that once you use something to dye yarn with acid dyes, never use that again for the preparation of food. But I can still use my dedicated dye equipment to dye fiber and yarn with food coloring. It's just if I'm using one set of utensils that is dedicated for dyeing yarn, I'm going to use all utensils that are dedicated for dyeing yarn. So I hope that that distinction makes sense if you're curious about why I'm using some of the things I use for acid dyes. I am going to place our wet fiber that is pre-soaked for a few hours onto a towel. And lightly, of course I did this in a goofy way, but I am lightly going to press to remove some of the liquid. The thing about pressing with something absorbent is that this is adding less agitation than if I were to pick it up and squeeze it. I maybe removed a little more than I intended, but the nice thing, it's not hard to add liquid back in. If, for example, I have a squeeze bottle. But I'm gonna set this aside, and I am going to place the fiber on a protected work surface, which today is going to be in the form of my catering steam pan. I am choosing to use this instead of, say, putting down plastic wrap because this is washable and reusable, and as we're adding dye in here, it will help contain things. A steam pan like this is definitely not required, but I have done similar things on, say, a cookie sheet. I'm going to take the two colors and I'm going to add them into two different cups. So this is our green apple, and then I also have blue raspberry lemonade. Now the nice thing about these two colors is that it can be, blue and green can be the hardest colors of KoolAid to come across. Back in the day, before I found a supermarket near me that carries a whole rainbow of KoolAid, I would have to buy them off of eBay. Now I plan to start by applying the KoolAid powder directly to the fiber. So I am coming in, and yeah, I think you can see, I'm adding it in largish sections. I have other videos where I've used KoolAid powder to do micro fine speckles, but I want the color to be a little more concentrated, so I'm going for a little bit of a larger splotch. Sometimes at the interface of where the fiber is, and sometimes not. Oh, I had considered doing some kind of blue and green gradient, but I think I'm gonna go for both relatively all over. And you can see some of these that I started with are, in fact, starting to sink in. Now, Paradise Fibers did recommend that you dissolve it into some water to make a paste and apply that. That can be a bit faster, but it really just depends on your preference. There's no problem. I used to make either pastes or use a fork to help with the application, and actually I'm wearing gloves. You don't have to wear gloves, but if you don't wear gloves, you will probably stain yourself. So keep that in mind. Here is some of this middle area where I added a lot of blue so far, and I'm now coming in with some green. And some of these sections are larger than others. But as I mentioned, we've got some resist in here because we've got areas where the dye, this food coloring that I'm adding, definitely cannot access the fiber beneath. Now, again, why am I going for these larger sections of color versus going for some micro tiny speckles? And well, that's based on what we would be able to see. Right, I am going to finish adding lots of green, and then we will flip this, which might add little bits of color there might be some on the pan, and so we might get some pastels on the fiber, and that is totally fine. This is really fun, and for me, I don't think I've dyed. I've tried to speckle roving a few times. There's even an old food coloring video where I tried, and actually when I spun it, the colors were beautiful and pastel and a lot of fun. Okay, I think I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm gonna now step in front of the camera to chat, but we're gonna give this some time to sink in. So if you wanted things to sink in a little bit faster, making a paste would make the whole process a little bit easier and let that color sort of sink into the fiber just overall faster. Because these speckles that we are doing on the fiber may not go very deep through all of the layers, they will blend out, leading to a more pastel color potentially overall. So in the past, when I've done things like this, you might be able to see it really well on the fiber, but then you almost get an opalescent feel on the yarn itself. And goodness, I'll try to find some pictures of my, I think it was liquid food coloring speckled roving that I spun that ended up being extremely pastel. It has been 10 minutes and you can tell that there are some areas where there is still dry powder, but there's a few things that we could do about this. We can actually try to poke it in, thereby sort of creating a little bit of a paste and adding some liquid, or we can push and press. So I'm gonna use one finger for the blue, and then I will use a different finger for the green in the areas where I feel like it needs it. Now I'm not rubbing, I'm really just pressing and letting some liquid come up, just to, at the very least, saturate all of that powder a little bit. There's a little powder that is around in the pan. I'm not gonna worry about that. Oh, and I never put my other glove back on. But now we are going to gently flip the fiber and dye the other side. Again, not moving it around in the pan very much. Now, the one thing about using dry powder is that you want to make sure your hands and gloves are really dry before you apply the powders onto the fiber. And the reason why you want your fingers dry is otherwise the powder will start sticking to your fingers or the gloves instead of on the fiber where we want it. So we're just gonna, once again, randomly apply this powder in sort of polka dots around the fiber. And as you're spinning, I worry a little bit less about asymmetry in my fiber, just because as the spinner, there's so many different ways you can decide to spin it. And since this, when we open it up, is one long piece of fiber, we will have good distribution of these colors. And again, because of that resist, there will be areas where there is no color. But I am trying to apply to like different sections of where the fiber is. So at least like if it's drafted, then it's not all just say like on the left side, if that makes sense. But I don't think I've used this exact method of applying more large splotches, but I wanted something that would show up on the roving, and I had a feeling if I did like light layer of speckles, it might not show up very well. These colors might be extremely subtle in the finished yarn. It depends on how far they penetrate and how much they blend out. But I am really, really excited that you can at least see them from the camera pulled back right now. But I think that is actually pretty good. Now, I think one difference this time is I am gonna go ahead and tap down the KoolAid now instead of waiting like I did the first time when I waited 10 minutes. And I might not hit every single one. We will be introducing more liquid as we go to steam set this, but I don't think there's any reason why we need to really wait 10 minutes this time. But my goal is to have the color sort of located where we positioned it at least a bit. But this is really fun. How many KoolAid packets do you need to do something like this? Well, today we didn't even use 2 whole packets. We used a fraction of the green and a fraction of the blue. And so we're gonna go steam set this for 30 minutes right now. And don't worry, we will use that leftover KoolAid on some other fiber in another video. But I have used as many as, goodness, possibly 20 packets of KoolAid on 100 grams of yarn. So in terms of getting really saturated colors, if you want to start with KoolAid, I recommend, again, that you supplement with liquid drops. Gently carrying the fiber over, I am going to place it in a steamer basket of my multi-pot, and I am going to steam set this for 30 minutes. Here on the stovetop, and the steamer basket is heating up. But if you prefer to microwave your fiber, I would put it in a microwave safe dish with a cover and then microwave it on high using 2-minute increments for a total of 4 to 6 minutes, or until the fiber is hot to touch. The reason why I say do it in increments is that microwaves can vary with their intensity and you don't want things to get too hot. The reason why the microwave timescale is shorter than the timescale in a steamer basket is that after you've microwaved it and you're waiting for it to cool completely, that takes a really long time. So then you are applying heat for a prolonged period of time. But yeah, I'll come back once the 30 minutes are up. It has been 30 minutes, and as you can see, we are nice and steamy. There might be a few areas where some Kool-Aid hasn't quite sunk in, but I am going to turn off the heat. Now, because it's hot, using some tongs, I'm going to carefully lift up the fiber and place it in a pan so that way it can cool completely before we wash it. Now, the Kool-Aid packets don't have any sugar, so we don't have to worry about that, but we do have flavoring and other stuff we do want to rinse out. But I'm gonna let this cool until it's completely room temperature before we go and wash it. Oh, Patty, I am so excited to open this up and then see what it looks like, and then I'll braid it all pretty. I'm very excited. Our fiber is completely cool, and so now I'm gonna take it and gently put it in some plain tap water so we can start a very gentle washing process. Oh, it looks like some parts may have dried out a little bit. Since I don't want to agitate this very much at all, I'm actually going to let it just soak here in this tap water for a little bit. But the one thing that you should be noticing, those color patches are not moving at all. So we're not seeing any bleeding. So I'm gonna let this soak for 5-10 minutes, then we'll come back and add some soap and do some more rinses. Okay, I am going to gently pick up the fiber, trying hard to not press a ton or rub. There is no color in that rinse. And I am going to gently refill my basin and add just a drop of this clear dish soap. We don't want to add a lot of agitation to the fiber, but we do want to help make sure everything comes out of it. And so I'm trying not to run the water directly on the fiber, but once again, I am going to fill up this basin and then just let this soak in the soapy water for a little bit. I'm going to fill the basin up as much as I can so there's the greatest volume of water, and just gently give it some gentle presses. You don't want to rub it. If you rub it, you will felt it. Now, there's no bleeding right here. We're not expecting any bleeding today. If you are seeing bleeding with your roving, I recommend that you, again, do soaks, maybe use Synthropol or something. But if there's a ton of bleeding, I might wait to do heavy washing and rinsing until after you have spun it, because then there's less risk of felting. I find that the washing stage is one where people are at most risk of creating that felted yarn. But anyway, I'm gonna let it soak for another 5-10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Patty, I'm so excited for how this fiber is turning out. As I'm picking it up, I'm being very careful, again, to not cause agitation. And from this point forward, we're gonna go through, I wanna make sure all the soap is out, but we're gonna just do some extremely careful rinses, filling this up and then changing the water 1 or 2 more times, letting it soak versus doing something much more vigorous. This is going to allow us to rinse out everything that needs to, and then I am going to carefully transfer the fiber to my spin dryer to spin out a lot of the water. If you don't have a spin dryer, you can place it on a towel again, gently press to remove that liquid, and then hang it up to dry, and then we'll come back to look at the dry fiber. Patty doll, this is beautiful. The technique worked as well as it could have, and we have these bold splotches of green and blue. And there's not a ton of contrast between these colors with this warm gray backdrop of this BFL silk blend from Paradise Fibers. But as you spin and sort of draw the fibers across one another, and this green and blue, those pops, blend in with the gray more, it's gonna make everything settle, but also have short color changes and shifts. I find a lot of times when I spin, the color changes end up being rather long, which isn't a problem at all. And so this tiny method of applying color is something that I know I want to explore spinning myself in the future. Now it is time to open this up if I find the correct side. I always do this. And we can see the effects that our resist did and did not have. I think looking at this, it did not have a huge difference. It certainly spaces out these speckles a bit more, which I think is totally fine. There's no problem with having the speckles a little more spread out. And in fact, I think that had I dyed the fiber like this all laid out, it honestly would have been harder for me to keep things as spaced out as I did. So having it in the braid let me add them as heavily as I want when the effect I wanted was them more spread out. And so I think that that is awesome. Now I'm going to just quickly fluff up the fiber and re-braid it so that way it can be nice and protected. I know I just finished fluffing, but I wanted to show how shallow the penetration is of some of these speckles. Some went a bit deeper, but this really is going to blend out. Like, so some it's a little heavier, but you can see it's not going very, very deep. Oh, it's just so pretty. Even now, there is a bit of a difference between how the fiber looks at this moment and how it did right after I brought it down and dyed. The specks and spots of color are a lot softer now than they were at that beginning point. Patty, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. I really hope you are going to enjoy this fiber. And I have to say, I think I might explore something very similar on the other half of this fiber that I have, because the only regret I have is that I don't get to be the one to spin this. Again, Patty, thank you for being my lab partner. And if you would like to learn more about how you can be a lab partner for an episode of Dyepot Weekly, get shout outs in the video, and provide input on the yarn base and colors to avoid as I am creating a new episode, you can go find more details in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. And if the listing is sold out, I do have a waiting list, so you can just send me a message on Etsy and I can let you know when I release more slots. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Oh, I can't decide which side I like looking at more. It was so fun to go back to my roots and play with KoolAid and dye some fiber. And there is some KoolAid left over, and I did use that to dye more yarn. I don't know yet when that video will come out, but don't worry, I didn't leave any KoolAid behind. I also want to give another really big thank you to Paradise Fibers for sending me the fiber and continuing to send me the Fiber of the Month Club for free. Again, this video is not sponsored by them, but I was very excited to play with this. How could I resist? Once again, you can find affiliate links down in the video description. Man, back in the spring of 2020, I really wanted to create more spinning videos, but the stars just didn't align between time that I had to sit down and spin, when the light was good enough for filming, or when there weren't wild children who would knock the tripod over and potentially damage my very, very important camera. So I do hope to create more spinning content someday, and I think now that I have more flexibility in my schedule on the horizon, although with summer coming, some of that might go away. Anyway, I think if you would like to see me do another journey where I dye the fiber and then spin the yarn and sort of vlog the spinning in some kind of way, please let me know down in the comments below. I know this is something people are in general really interested in and something I'd like to do. I even think I have a spinning video in my, probably the highlighter fiber, in my like to be edited file. But yeah, I really would like to create more content like that going forward. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.